Hello there, so what is collaborative mapping? Two or more mappers working together sounds like it would be correct, but that definition is far too broad. Every ranked map would be collaboration in that case since every ranked map receives input through mods. Similarly, guest difficulties would also be considered collaborative work when they're really just separate maps stuck onto the same map set. For the average mapper, collab mapping has a much more strict definition, and falling under that definition is one type of collaboration which has risen to the top as the most favored among mappers. Nearly all collab maps abide by the same core concept, which honestly, I don't know if I can consider a good thing. For starters, you all know Mazarin, right? He's a guy famous for creating absurdly difficult maps of a rather obscure genre of music by Osu standards. His first ranked map, Obsidian Crown, fits his image perfectly. It's a 6-minute marathon full of 210 BPM streams, and it reaches over 6.5 stars. The map isn't his alone though, it's actually a group effort between him and myself, organized in that aforementioned popular collab structure. The single difficulty here is essentially split into two distinct sections by the break in the middle. The first half is fairly simple, featuring a good deal of low-density rhythms to match the song's relatively tame intensity, while the second half transitions from the atmospheric mid-section into some hardcore percussion accompanied by a dude screaming beyond comprehension. Of course, this is paired appropriately, with rhythms requiring player stamina levels past that of the first half, reflecting the song just as it deserves. So, how was this collaboratively worked on? Probably the best way it could. I mapped the first half without any direct influence from Mazarin, while he mapped the second half without any direct influence from me. This basic idea, clarified in the map's online description, is how almost all collabs are organized, separate yet together. We just merged our parts into the same map file without much consideration for how each other's were designed, and because this song was so different between each half, variations caused by different mapping preferences worked in its favor. While sticking to the most popular type of mapping collaboration isn't inherently a problem, as Obsidian Crown shows, it still isn't ideal. I think this way of collaborating is often poorly handled by mappers, and because it dominates the mapping scene, other forms of potentially interesting collaboration are left unexplored. This was the first collab map I participated in. Like Obsidian Crown, it also used the separate yet together type of organization, but I don't think it turned out quite as well. The song was divided into a bunch of small parts, each of which was distributed among 6 mappers, as clearly shown by its online description, bookmarks in the editor, and names storyboarded in the bottom left. Pretty standard practice for collab maps. What makes me dislike the map though is how, as a mapper, I failed to adapt to a collaborative setting. Look at Handsome's 10-second part here. Even with little mapping experience 2.5 years ago, he neatly composed these objects to form repeated geometric shapes. An appropriate choice given the song repeats the same sounds on loop every 4 beats. Then the next 10 seconds are my part. I've extensively talked about how terrible of a mapper I was this long ago already, and it definitely showed through my mapping choices here. The song itself had barely changed between Handsome's part and mine, while the way it was mapped took on a completely new face. I mapped using concepts which I was familiar with at the time, unorganized jumps and streams, and that created unnecessary contrast with Handsome's previous part. This shift in design makes essentially no sense with the song and would never be accepted on an individual's map. Yet in all the 16 pages of the map's thread, nobody thought it deserved mention. In hindsight, it was definitely wrong and nobody cared. The reason, as far as I could tell, because it was a collab. As a new mapper who both witnessed and experienced making these types of nonsensical collaborative maps from the start, I accepted this as one of the many odd anomalies of Osu mapping. Of course 2 mappers design things differently. What other outcome should I expect, right? I think most other mappers learn that this is the way collabs work on Osu, so they come to accept it just like I had, and that might not be for the best. While I didn't know what I was doing wrong in 2014, I evolved as a mapper over time, and my perspective on collabs changed alongside that. My later collab maps began to look a bit more cohesive. I learned how to interpret the ways other mappers handled object composition and was therefore able to replicate a bit of that when working collaboratively. Like, this is a collab between a mapper named Milan and myself, wherein differences between collab parts aren't nearly as blatant as those of the last 2 maps. If these storyboarded names weren't here or these bookmarks weren't in the timeline, it would be hard for most people to tell that this was a collab at all. Maybe that sounds unappealing, but it was kind of the point. To make a difficulty that represented the song through its repeated elements, not a difficulty mashing together incoherent ideologies from two different mappers. As mappers improve, they should understand how to coordinate collab maps to better reflect songs, just as Milan and I had done here, but that doesn't always happen. Most often, mappers do learn how to manage different mapping concepts, but choose not to use that knowledge. They instead use collaboration in this popular, separate yet connected format as an excuse to ignore consistency representing music. For example, this is a map which does exactly what I dislike. It's a collaboration between 9 different mappers, 6 of which handle essentially the same repeated phrase in the chorus. What would make the most sense for the map is 6 mappers using similar concepts to express the same part of the song, but instead, each mapper takes a different approach. The first mapper uses fairly simple half-beat rhythm with generally high spacing. The second chooses a mix of extremely low and high spacing combined with unexpected doubles and offbeat emphasis and rhythm. The fourth chooses rhythm of almost entirely circles, featuring more stacks and streams than any other part. The fifth is just inconsistent within itself, trying out multiple different ideas without sticking to any specifically. You get what I'm trying to say. Each part is different, and that doesn't reflect the song. A collaborative map organized in this way naturally won't have the exact same results between each segment, but that doesn't make it a defense for disregarding consistency altogether. Collab maps should still follow a song as closely as possible, even if it goes against the normalities promoted by this popular way of organizing group maps. Collaboration isn't a reason to excuse the problem, it is the problem, which in situations like this, I can't find myself to fully support. Partially though, I don't know. I'm conflicted. You see, everything logically tells me this is wrong. A map that smashes different ideas in random time slots without regards for a song is not good, and I've known that ever since I learned how to properly organize maps. Most collab maps aren't made with closely following the music in mind, and instead exist for fun or out of laziness, but in spite of their problems, I find collaborations like this to be some of the most interesting maps out there. Collaborative maps using this separate yet together concept often poorly represent a song, but at the same time, they hold value in their own way. To explain what I mean, let's talk about the map which alone led to my strengthened appreciation of collabs. This map was ranked in the second half of 2015, and when I played it, it instantly became one of my favorites. A cool song paired with complex rhythm and engaging difficulty created by mappers I loved. The map was uploaded by Captin 1, a guy who I looked up to since I started mapping, and according to its online description, the map was also made in collaboration with Skystar, a mapper whose knowledge and experience outclasses almost everyone. It seemed like the perfect combination in my eyes given how enjoyable the map turned out, which got me a little interested. Who mapped which parts? The description didn't list any timestamps, and there was no storyboard to spell it out for me either. All I could rely on were bookmarks in the editor, which, in my experience, always indicated part differentiation in collabs. I looked in the map briefly and assumed that parts were organized in a fairly straightforward way. Captain 1 took the first section since he was a map set host. That was the normal thing to do. Skystar took the second, and the two mappers alternated after each bookmark from then on. That made enough sense to me initially, but as I played the map more and more over the next few months, upwards of 20 times to completion, I started to think otherwise. The minor details of the map began to pop out at me, especially because I had been improving as a mapper around this time as well. Some sections featured clearly copied and pasted patterns which I found pretty cool, like this one of curved sliders rotated by 60 degrees each, and this one of straight sliders switching between 90-degree rotations and symmetrical flipping. These sections managed spacing and movement in ways I appreciated as well, like the stark contrast between individual points of emphasis with small and large spacing here, or this part's back and forth movement between objects. Other sections were designed more loosely. Objects were less often copied and pasted, and therefore rarely formed neat or pretty patterns. These sections also included less contrast and spacing. Most of it was just generally large, especially after slider ends. And they also included a lot more wide angles between objects, a type of movement which the other sections mostly avoided. Overall, I noticed I preferred playing those first types of sections more than those second types, and assumed that was because each was mapped by a different mapper. So because of that, I decided to do a little investigating. I went into the editor to find out which bookmarked segments were whose, but then I realized that the inexperienced me of a few months prior had misdiagnosed the map. By checking out a few maps from Captain and Skystar, I began to recognize who created which parts, and that parts weren't actually dictated by bookmarks. This first 11-second bit was made by Skystar, which was pretty weird since he wasn't the map set host. The next 11 seconds were by Captain, and in these small chunks, chunks, not clarified anywhere, parts of the map alternated until the end. It sounds so lame, but knowing who mapped which parts of the collab was what interested me more while playing than the map's adrenaline-inducing song, rhythm complexity, and difficulty. Solving the mystery behind what made up Skystar's parts and what made up Captain's was just such a cool feeling. Like having the eye to see a specific directorial technique or cut of animation and associate it with a specific director or animator. Mapping is admittedly not as prestigious as either of those art forms, but this sort of identification nonetheless evokes the same feeling, and that's something I find really cool about collabs. Two or more mappers exist in the same creation presenting different ideas, and those differences are engaging to take notice of. While it doesn't reflect a song perfectly, it definitely is valuable to me, and as far as I know, it is to others too. Like, I recall the mapper Nathan collaborating with two others on a map and questioning who in the mapping world could recognize the subtle differences between parts. And recently the mapper Vinxis asked if people could figure out the mappers behind one of his map set's collab difficulties. Both of these show that the appeal isn't only personal, other mappers find collabs cool in the same way. Every time I play a collab map, this is what I'm thinking about: who mapped each part, and what elements of object composition could hint at that. This peculiarity of mapping is definitely interesting, and I'm glad other people can appreciate it as much as I do. But still, that only covers the separate yet together type of collab maps. I wish mappers would try exploring more of what collaboration has to offer, since other types can be interesting as well. For example, this map is a collab between me and a guy I know in person. I taught him some basics of map design by correcting his mistakes while progressively mapping through the song together. Even though he didn't retain much of that info, it was an enjoyable experience and not one I imagine many others have gone through. Then there's this map, which is a collab in an even less common way. Deets made a difficulty for the song in 2014, and I modified it up to 2017 standards when adapting it for my own map set. It turned out alright, and I think it was pretty fun to try out a new way of creating a map. The only problem that came about was its naming. Even though it technically was a collab map, it seemed weird to call it one because, for the average mapper, collab implies separate yet together organization. In the end, it was ranked with this silly name. Yeah, that aside, my point is that collab maps don't just need to be individuals mapping different sections of a song, then combining them into one map. Collabs can use different forms of organization, which produce vastly different results, as I've experienced with these two maps, and I think they may be interesting enough to be worth trying out. Anyway, thanks to these guys for supporting this video, and I'll see you next week.